In a quiet neighborhood nestled in the heart of the Northwest, a family's world was shattered in a single, deafening moment. A gunshot rang out, breaking the silence of the night, leaving behind questions that no one wanted to ask, but everyone demanded to be answered. What led a teenager, still navigating the turbulence of adolescence, to stand face to face with his own father, weapon in hand? Was this a tragic act of self-defense, or a confrontation that spiraled into something no one could have foreseen? As investigators pieced together the fragments of that fateful evening, the story that emerged left even the most seasoned detectives questioning everything they thought they knew about family, loyalty, and the human capacity for conflict. A gunshot in the night, the kind of sound that's meant to break hearts, to shock even the toughest of us into silence. It wasn't just a sound that shattered the quiet of a small, seemingly ordinary town. It was a sound that shattered a family, that left the lives of everyone involved marked forever. A teenager, barely old enough to drive, stood accused of taking his father's life, ending a heated argument in a flash of violence. But what led to that moment? Was it just a tragic misunderstanding, or was something more complicated at play? Was this a desperate cry for help, a breaking point after years of conflict, or a cold, deliberate act? The victim, Thomas Caldwell, was a man well known in his community. Respected by many, he had built a life for himself and his family in this quiet corner of the Northwest. A father, a husband, a friend to some, his reputation was one of stability and success. His career had flourished in the local construction industry, and he was often seen helping his neighbors, offering advice or lending a hand when needed. To most, he was the kind of person who seemed untouchable by anything that could rattle the foundation of his life. But behind closed doors, in the safety of his home, things weren't always as they seemed. The teen, Caleb Caldwell, was a 17-year-old high school student who had always lived in his father's shadow. On the outside, he appeared to be like any other teenager, caught in the tumult of adolescence with his own battles, his own frustrations. But those who knew him well would tell a different story. One of a troubled teen who seemed to carry a heavy burden on his shoulders, someone who struggled with the weight of his father's expectations, someone whose relationship with Thomas was growing more strained by the day. Caleb was known to be quiet, withdrawn, sometimes angry, though he never let it show to the outside world. It was the kind of anger that built up over time, slow, steady, but ultimately consuming. That fateful night, the Caldwell's home became the setting for an argument that escalated beyond anyone's control. It was late when the shouting began, a father, frustrated with his son's lack of direction, and a son, tired of the relentless pressure, the constant comparisons. Caleb had had enough. But no one could have predicted that a simple argument would end in violence. No one knew that just a few moments later, Caleb would hold a gun, his father's life hanging in the balance. The crime took place in a quiet suburban neighborhood, far removed from the chaos of the city, in a part of the Northwest known for its tight-knit community and serene atmosphere. A place where, on the surface, things seemed perfect. But now, everything had changed. The news of the shooting spread like wildfire through the small town, leaving a wave of shock and disbelief in its wake. This wasn't just another crime in a distant city. This was something that had happened right under their noses, something that could have been happening in any one of their homes. A family torn apart, a father gone, a teen's future uncertain. In the months leading up to the night of the shooting, there had been whispers, a quiet hum of tension beneath the surface of the Caldwell family's seemingly peaceful life. What was once a bond between father and son, built on the shared experiences of family trips and little league games, had deteriorated. Thomas Caldwell, the father, was a man of discipline, one who believed in hard work and the need for his son to follow a clear, structured path. Caleb, on the other hand, was a young man on the edge, caught between the weight of his father's expectations and the desire to carve out his own identity. They had clashed before, but the arguments had always been contained, manageable. Until now. Thomas had always been the kind of father who believed in tough love. He pushed Caleb to do his best, to rise above mediocrity, to take his future seriously. But in Caleb's eyes, it often felt like nothing was ever good enough. Each success seemed overshadowed by his father's desire for more, a demand for perfection that Caleb simply could not meet. It wasn't that he didn't try. It was that, for Caleb, no matter how hard he worked, it was never enough. With every passing month, the arguments became more frequent, more heated. Caleb withdrew further into himself, refusing to confide in anyone, including his mother, who had long since given up trying to mediate the growing divide between them. It was clear that the tension wasn't a passing phase. It wasn't simply the growing pains of adolescence. It was something deeper, something that neither father nor son knew how to fix. What once might have been a typical father-son disagreement had turned into something more ominous, a situation where both sides were entrenched in their views, unwilling to budge. To the outside world, it may have looked like a typical case of fatherly discipline clashing with teenage rebellion. But those close to the family knew something else was at play. A sense of alienation had set in, and Caleb's attempts to break free from his father's expectations only seemed to pull him further into a corner, one he could no longer escape. The day of the shooting started out no differently than any other. Caleb had been home from school early that afternoon, having skipped his last class to avoid another tense conversation with his father. His mother, who had long been caught in the middle of their battles, was at work, leaving the two of them alone for most of the day. And it was during these few hours of solitude that the argument began. There was no real warning. A disagreement, like so many others, started over a seemingly small issue. But this time, something had changed. Caleb had had enough. Witnesses, if there had been any, would later tell police that they heard the shouting. But no one had seen what really happened in those crucial moments. Neighbors recalled hearing the raised voices, but none had dared intervene. It wasn't unusual for the Caldwells to have disagreements, though none of them had ever escalated like this. To them, it was just another family squabble. They didn't know that, this time, things would go far beyond words. It's unclear exactly what was said, but those who knew Caleb would later describe him as on edge, angry, even desperate. Some even suggested that he may have been afraid of being trapped in a life that was set for him by someone else, afraid that if he didn't act now, he would lose his chance to break free. His father, on the other hand, had no idea just how close to the edge his son was. Thomas had always thought of Caleb as someone who would eventually come around. He thought the anger was just part of growing up, something that would pass. But it didn't pass. And that day, Caleb found himself in a place where his anger and fear collided. What happened next unfolded in an instant. The gun, belonging to Thomas, had been in the house for years, legally registered, kept in a safe place. Caleb knew where it was. But that afternoon, in a moment of impulsive rage, something inside him snapped. The exact chain of events remains unclear, but the outcome is inarguable. Caleb, in the heat of their argument, reached for the weapon and shot his father. The argument started like many others, small words, rising voices, but this time, something inside Caleb snapped. The trigger wasn't just an angry word or a miscommunication. It was a culmination of months of frustration, hurt, and emotional isolation. A moment where, for Caleb, everything seemed to collide, and the weight of his father's expectations became too much to bear. What started as a father trying to discipline his son, as he had done countless times before, spiraled into a deadly confrontation. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It never was. The specifics of what was said during those final moments are still contested. Some say it was over a seemingly trivial disagreement about Caleb's grades. Others claim it was the culmination of years of emotional strain between father and son, something neither could see clearly until it was too late. But on this day, the father, Thomas, had become a symbol of all that Caleb resented. The demanding voice in his head, the constant pressure to live up to impossible standards. Caleb had reached his breaking point. At some point in the argument, Thomas likely raised his voice, his booming presence often drowning out the softer, quieter words of his son. Caleb, feeling cornered, both physically and emotionally, did what no one could have predicted. In a moment of desperation, he did what he thought he had to do to escape. He grabbed the gun. The weapon, a handgun legally registered to Thomas Caldwell, had been kept locked away in a safe for years. The father had been a responsible gun owner, someone who believed in safety and security. But in that moment, Caleb knew exactly where the key was kept. He knew the routine, knew how to bypass his father's defenses. And so, when the argument reached its peak, when every word from Thomas seemed to cut deeper than the last, Caleb acted. Witnesses from the neighborhood, though few, remember the sound of the shouting, though none were able to see what actually took place inside the house. The walls of the Caldwell home, often a silent witness to family disputes, would now bear the grim history of one of its most tragic moments. A loud, echoing noise pierced the night, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Neighbors immediately called 911, frantic, but unsure of what had just happened. Some reported hearing yelling, others the sound of something heavy being dropped. Then the shot. the violent interruption of a father's life and a son's future. Inside the house, chaos erupted. Thomas Caldwell fell, his body crumpling to the floor as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The argument, once a battle of words, had now become a deadly confrontation. Caleb, standing over his father, was left with a choice: flee, face the consequences, or something else entirely. His mind, clouded by the intense emotion of the moment, could hardly process the gravity of his actions. Was this a moment of sheer rage? A knee-jerk reaction to years of pent-up anger? Or was it something far more complex? Caleb would later say that he never meant to kill his father. But as the gun fell from his hand and the finality of his actions settled in, he would soon realize that nothing would ever be the same again. At 6:34 p.m., the first 911 call came in. A frantic voice on the other end of the line, shaking, barely coherent. The caller, the teen's mother, who had arrived home to find the aftermath of the horror, pleaded with the dispatcher, "My husband, he's on the floor." "I think he's gone." The dispatcher's voice, calm yet urgent, tried to keep the situation under control, instructing her to check for a pulse, asking if anyone had a medical history that could explain the situation. But it was clear from the tone of the conversation, this wasn't a medical emergency. This was something far worse. As emergency responders raced to the scene, the street outside the Caldwell home became a hauntingly quiet place. Police lights flashed in the distance, their blue and red hues reflecting off the dark windows of nearby houses. The streets, usually full of the sounds of suburban life, were eerily still. The calm before the storm had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable chaos that follows a tragedy like this. By the time law enforcement arrived, Caleb had already fled the scene. He had left his father lying in a pool of blood, unable to process what had just happened. The detectives on the case would later state that Caleb had been found several miles from the house, disoriented and confused, but never attempting to run far. He was not on the verge of escaping. He had nowhere to go. The police report would later reveal something chilling about Caleb's state of mind. When asked why he had done it, his response was simple: "I didn't know what else to do." His voice trembled, the weight of his actions pressing down on him even in the hours following the event. Did Caleb truly feel trapped, so consumed by the constant battle with his father that he felt there was no other way out? Or did something deeper drive him to this act? Something he couldn't understand himself. But as the investigation unfolded, new details began to emerge, and the story began to take an even darker turn. What was initially thought to be a tragic case of a son snapping under pressure quickly evolved into something that raised more questions than answers. Was this an act of cold-blooded murder, or a desperate act of survival? And as the truth began to unravel, it seemed the story was far from over. The moments following the shooting were not just an immediate aftermath of violence, but the beginning of a deeper, more complex unraveling of lives. In the days and weeks that followed, the question wasn't just who pulled the trigger, but why did they do it? It's easy to reduce a case like this to its most shocking aspects: the weapon, the bloodshed, the fractured family. But when we step beyond those physical markers, we find the heart of the tragedy, the intricate web of emotions, memories, and choices that led to this point. And in this case, the truth isn't as simple as guilt or innocence. In Caleb's eyes, a world had just shifted. This wasn't the triumph of winning some long-sought battle. It was the collapse of everything he had ever known. In the heat of the argument, it was as if the world had become a tunnel, narrowing with every word his father said. In those moments, Caleb wasn't thinking of consequences or justice. He was thinking of survival. Not survival in the physical sense, but emotional survival. Was the loss of his father something that could be undone? Could he somehow reconcile the violent act with the person he once knew himself to be? Caleb would later say that he had never imagined things could go that far. He wasn't a violent person, he insisted. But the years of emotional isolation, the constant feeling of not measuring up, had been wearing him down, quietly, relentlessly. And in that one critical moment, with the words of his father ringing in his ears, it was as if his entire existence had been reduced to a single, unbearable truth. He was never going to escape. He was never going to be good enough. But the psychological complexity of the case doesn't end there. For the loved ones left behind, his mother, his siblings, the people who had once looked to Thomas as a pillar of strength, the question was not only about why Caleb did what he did, but how to reconcile the man they had known with the events of that night. Thomas Caldwell, to many, had been a man of integrity, someone who worked tirelessly for his family, someone who believed in discipline and structure. He had been a respected figure in the community. But behind closed doors, like so many fathers, there were cracks, unseen to the outside world, yet deeply felt by those closest to him. Thomas was not a perfect man. He was hard, demanding, and at times emotionally distant. He had a vision for his children, especially Caleb, that didn't always align with his son's reality. Some of those who knew Thomas would say that his discipline was a product of love, that he wanted nothing more than for his son to succeed, to rise above what he saw as a difficult world. But others, those closer to Caleb, would say that the pressure had built to the point of suffocation. It was as if Thomas's love was conditional, something Caleb had to earn. A child's sense of worth tied to an unspoken bar of excellence that, no matter how high Caleb reached, would never be enough. So what does this tragedy say about us as a society? What does it say about how we raise our children, how we define success, how we see ourselves as parents? The story isn't one of a villain and a victim. It's about two people, father and son, caught in a cycle of miscommunication, unspoken pain, and unmet expectations. And in a world where silence often speaks louder than words, the lack of understanding between them became the echo that eventually led to disaster. Caleb's mother, Claire, was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered family. She stood by her son, yet the gravity of his actions was impossible to ignore. In the wake of her husband's death, she grappled with a complex range of emotions: grief, anger, disbelief. She had lost her partner of years, a man she had built a life with. But she also had to confront the son who was now accused of taking him away. There was no easy path through this. She was torn between the unbearable pain of losing her husband and the overwhelming sense of responsibility she felt for her son's actions. Could she forgive him? Could she understand the choices he had made? Was there a way to rebuild the family, or had that moment irrevocably destroyed it all? What makes this case even more heart-wrenching is the ethical dilemma it poses. At what point does the weight of emotional pain justify a violent reaction? Could Caleb have turned out differently if he had received more support? If his father had understood the struggles he faced, would there have been a different outcome? These are questions that have no easy answers. But the fact remains, there is no black and white answer to the complexity of human behavior. Every act, every decision, is shaped by an intricate web of internal and external forces. The question remains, however, was this act truly one of self-defense, as Caleb would later claim? Or was it a cold, calculated decision to end the conflict once and for all? And in the aftermath, the trial would ultimately have to address not just the specifics of that night, but the broader, more difficult truths. How could a father and son, who once shared a home and a life, end up in such an irreversible moment of violence? Caleb's defense attorney would argue that this was not a case of cold-blooded murder, but a tragic accident born from years of emotional distress and manipulation. His father, they would say, was a man who had neglected to see the internal battle his son was fighting. But the prosecution would insist that Caleb knew exactly what he was doing, that this wasn't just a reactive, panicked decision, but a deliberate action driven by years of suppressed rage and resentment. What became clear in the aftermath of the shooting was that this wasn't just a tragedy for the immediate family, but a reflection of the broader issues surrounding the emotional health of young people, the pressures placed on them, and the hidden battles they fight behind closed doors. The case would serve as a painful reminder of how little we often know about the inner lives of those we care about, and how easily we can misinterpret or overlook their needs. Caleb may have thought he was making a choice to protect himself, but what he didn't realize was that this was a decision that would destroy everything he had known, including the possibility of ever finding peace with his past. A single moment can change everything, and the ripple effects of that moment stretch far beyond the immediate family involved. For Caleb Caldwell, his life had already been irrevocably altered, but what about those left behind? The echoes of the shooting resonated through the community, reverberating off every familiar face, every place where family and friends once gathered. This wasn't just a tragedy confined to one home. This was a heartbreak that would bleed into the lives of everyone who knew them, everyone who had once thought of them as an ordinary family. How could something so devastating have been hidden in plain sight? Could anyone have seen it coming? And now, could anyone truly make sense of it? In the days following the shooting, the neighborhood was cloaked in an air of disbelief. People who had once greeted the Caldwell family at the mailbox or waved across the street now found themselves reflecting on their own assumptions, on their own relationships with their children, their spouses, their neighbors. Were there warning signs they had missed? Was this a tragedy waiting to happen, Or was it an anomaly? An event that defied logic and left everyone grasping for meaning? Friends of the Caldwell family were at a loss for words. Angela, a longtime friend of Caleb's mother, Claire, described the family as just so normal. They were the type of family that attended community events, volunteered for local charities, and always seemed to be there for one another. Angela remembered Caleb as a quiet but polite boy who never showed any signs of aggression. He was always so sweet, Angela recalled. I just can't understand how something like this could have happened. But for all the friends who couldn't make sense of it, there were others who began to share pieces of the puzzle that had been hidden beneath the surface for so long. In hindsight, many wondered if there had been cracks in the foundation all along. On the night of the shooting, a group of neighbors gathered outside the Caldwell home, their faces reflecting the confusion and sorrow that had gripped the entire town. Some had heard the police sirens that had echoed through the usually quiet streets. Others had seen the flashing red and blue lights as they danced across their windows. But even with all the uncertainty swirling in the air, one thing was clear: no one saw it coming. For weeks after the shooting, the town was divided. Some couldn't understand how a son could turn on his father in such a violent way, and they placed blame on Caleb for his actions. Others couldn't help but wonder about the environment that had shaped him, the pressures he had faced, and the strained relationship that, it seemed, had reached its tragic end. While some blamed the boy, others questioned the role of a broken family, of a society that had left Caleb to suffer in silence. Social media became a battleground for opinions. News outlets were quick to share the details of the case, and every new development seemed to fuel the emotional firestorm. Local news stations were filled with live reports, their cameras capturing residents standing in front of the family home, some placing flowers and candles, others simply staring into the distance, grappling with a tragedy that felt too close to home. A town that had always been tight-knit now felt like it was unraveling. People posted their thoughts, opinions, and condolences online, each trying to make sense of the unimaginable. One tweet from a local high school teacher summed up the collective heartbreak. How could a son do this to his father? Our hearts are heavy for this family, but we also wonder if we, as a community, could have done more. In the wake of the tragedy, the community held a candlelight vigil in front of the Caldwell home. The soft glow of hundreds of flickering candles illuminated the faces of mourners, as tears mixed with the somber silence that surrounded the gathering. No one seemed to have the right answers, but everyone knew that something had been lost, something fragile, something irreplaceable. Claire Caldwell, the mother, stood quietly by, surrounded by family members who held her up as best they could. She had always been known for her warmth and grace, but now she appeared fragile, her face a mask of exhaustion and heartbreak. No one knew how to help her. No one knew how to heal the pain that had overwhelmed her family. She clung to a sense of disbelief, struggling to reconcile the son she once knew with the boy who had taken his father's life. The town's grief quickly turned into soul-searching. Everyone seemed to ask the same questions. How could something like this happen? How could this young man, who had been a friend, a neighbor, a student, end up in a place so dark that he felt there was no way out? And more importantly, what could the community have done differently? Were there signs that had been missed? Could they have intervened before it reached this point? In the months that followed, discussions began to turn toward prevention. Local mental health advocates held forums on the importance of recognizing signs of distress in teenagers, of offering support to families who might be struggling with issues they couldn't talk about. Parents attended workshops on how to spot the signs of depression, anxiety, or anger in their children, and local schools began implementing programs to address the emotional health of their students. It was clear that, while the tragedy couldn't be undone, there was a push to prevent other families from suffering the same fate. But for many, the question remained: could it have been prevented? Could a tragedy like this ever have been avoided? This wasn't just the story of one family. It was the story of an entire community grappling with an issue that transcended family lines. The tragedy brought out a rawness in everyone, a vulnerability they hadn't known they had. And for some, the emotional scars would remain long after the courtroom drama had concluded. Caleb Caldwell's actions would forever be a part of the town's history, but so too would the community's response, their collective mourning, and their search for answers.